Craig Harlan Gotham was 55 years old, and he lived in a small farming town in Illinois called Manitou. If you're not from that part of the Midwest, you might not even know a place like that exists. It's mostly fields along flat roads, a handful of businesses, and people who spend their days working the land or running local shops. But on August 5th, 2020, Craig wasn't in Manitou, several hours south at a spot that couldn't feel more different than the quiet farm fields back home. He was at Lake of the Ozarks. If you've never heard of it, this isn't some small fishing lake. It's a massive, twisting reservoir created when a dam was built on the Osage River back in the 1930s. Over time, it became one of the busiest recreational lakes in the Midwest. Picture over 1,000 miles of shoreline, resorts and rental houses everywhere, restaurants you can pull a boat up to, and in summer the water jammed with pontoons, fishing boats, speedboats, and jet skis. It's loud, crowded, and alive. For people like Craig, who came from towns where the biggest noise most days was a tractor or a passing semi, the lake was something entirely different, an escape. Now, he had brought his boat with him, a 4 Winds 240 Horizon. That's a 24-foot fiberglass runabout, the kind of boat you trailer behind a pickup. It's not huge like a yacht, but not small either, roomy enough for family or friends, and with the power to push through big lake water. Boats like that are built for days exactly like this, cruising channels, stopping in coves, then heading back out again. On board, you'd find the standard gear, life jackets, ropes, coolers, and an anchor stored up near the bow. An anchor is simple in concept but dangerous if handled wrong. It's heavy steel, shaped to catch the bottom. When you want to stop and hold your position, maybe for swimming or just drifting without moving, you drop it over the front of the boat, pay out rope, and let it dig into the lake bed. It keeps you from sliding around, but the rule every boater learns early is this: never ever move the boat forward with the anchor still down. That anchor becomes a dead weight, with the rope becoming a line under tension, and the forces involved are far greater than most people realize. At some point that day, Craig had used his anchor. That part is clear because later it would still be in the water. Maybe he had stopped in a quiet cove to rest, maybe he had taken a break before heading back out into the main channel. What matters is that when he left again, when he put the throttle down and aimed the bow into the broad open water, the anchor hadn't fully been brought back up. From the helm, it wouldn't have been obvious right away. The boat still moves, with the engine still pushing. To anyone watching from another boat or from shore, it looks completely normal. A man in his mid-50s standing at the wheel, staring down the main channel on a warm August afternoon. His posture steady, one hand on the wheel, the other near the throttle with his eyes forward. Just another boat among dozens, nothing unusual at all. But beneath the surface, that anchor dragged against the bottom. The rope stretched out and pulled tight, resisting every foot of the forward movement. And ropes under strain don't just sit still. They hum, they vibrate, and they twitch like they are alive. With each fiber holding back force it's not meant to carry for long. So the faster the boat moved, the more energy stored in that line. It was, in essence, a giant spring waiting to be released. Imagine stretching a rubber band until it's about to snap, except this wasn't a rubber band. It was a thick anchor line tied to steel weighing enough to hold a 24 boat in place. That tension built second by second, hidden below unnoticed by the man steering ahead. And then it let go. The anchor ripped free from the bottom all at once. The rope recoiled like a slingshot, releasing all the force it had built up in a single violent motion. The anchor didn't just rise gently out of the water, it hurled upward with the line whipping it like a weapon. In less than a second, it cleared the bow and came straight toward the helm, and the steel slammed into Craig's head. The sound would have been shocking, the crack of metal colliding with bone, louder than you'd ever expect. The blow shattered his skull instantly, with blood spraying across the deck, splattering against the interior, the windshield, and even into the air before falling back in drops. His body collapsed with his legs giving out, his arms loose, and the life knocked out of him in a single hit. This wasn't a glancing strike, it was direct, brutal, and final. Like I said before, anchors are built heavy for a reason. They're supposed to resist current and hold a boat steady. And with all that weight and all that mass, was now driving into the fragile structure of a human head at incredible speed. His skull fractured, caving in under the impact. The skin tore open, with blood pouring out onto the sheets, staining the fiberglass beneath him red. Anyone nearby would have seen it in horrifying clarity. One moment he was upright, steady at the wheel, and the next his body crumbled to the side, blood rushing, with the anchor clattering back down after its arc. The engine kept running and the boat was still moving forward, but its operator was slumped and bleeding heavily. On the deck, the scene was gruesome. Blood pooled near where he fell, slick across the non-slip surface. His hair matted instantly, the wound on his head open and catastrophic. This wasn't the kind of injury you patch up with bandages or even hope to stabilize. It was a fatal strike, the kind you see in industrial accidents, where a machine delivers more force than the human body can ever withstand. And yet, in that moment, people still rushed to act. Calls for help went out. Emergency services were alerted. Boats are often close enough on the lake that others see when something goes wrong, and the urgency would have been clear. A man down, struck massive head trauma. Craig was transported to the Lake Regional Hospital in Osage Beach. He was still alive when they moved him, but barely. The damage to his head and brain was just too severe. Less than 2 hours after the anchor struck him, doctors pronounced him dead at 7:04 p.m. The Missouri State Highway Patrol investigated, as they do with all serious accidents on the lake. The description was stark and simple. The boat was under power with the anchor still in the water. The rope pulled tight and the anchor released and catapulted out, striking the operator in the head. That was the entire chain of events. No alcohol, no storm, and no collision with another vessel. Just like many other cases, one oversight. One anchor not raised, and the physics of tension and release turning it into a weapon. Work inside a steel casting plant doesn't look like most jobs people picture when they think of factory work. It isn't a quiet assembly line or an air-conditioned warehouse. It's hot, heavy, and dangerous. In places like Elwood Engineered Casting in Hubbard Township, Ohio, workers handle molten steel heated to nearly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Imagine lava spilling from a volcano. That's about what's being moved inside these buildings every day, except instead of flowing naturally, it's poured and shaped by men and women who have to stand near it. The steel arrives in giant ladles, suspended by cranes, and is poured into molds to make parts used in trains, heavy equipment, or industrial machines. The job requires constant cleaning, moving, and adjusting. Hoses spraying water, machines vibrating, and cranes shifting overhead. And every single step has risks. Heat alone can blister skin from several feet away. A spill can turn fatal instantly. Steam explosions, equipment failures, or human errors can unleash violence in a second. The Bureau of Labor Statistics records workplace fatalities in the United States every year. Manufacturing ranks consistently high, and foundries where molten metal is poured and shaped are some of the worst. Hundreds of workers are killed annually in heavy manufacturing, and thousands more are injured. Between 2011 and 2019, the US averaged more than 350 deaths per year in manufacturing settings, with dozens specifically in metal production. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration has cited molten metal facilities repeatedly for violations because accidents are so often catastrophic. There's rarely such a thing as a minor injury when you're dealing with liquid steel hot enough to melt flesh and bone on contact. This is the world Jawalen T. Patterson walked into. He was 30 years old, working at Elwood Engineered Casting. On January 13th, 2024, he was in the pit, a lower area beneath where molten steel was being poured, with a hose in his hands. His job was to wash down leaks in the casting process, basically keeping things clean and controlled as the liquid metal moved from the ladles into molds. It was still dark outside just before 5 in the morning, when most people were still in bed. Inside the plant though, the work was already underway. Above him, a malfunction started. Molten steel nearly 3,000 degrees began leaking into the pit where he stood. Someone shouted and a crane moved the ladle to try to stop the flow. Jawalen was below, spraying and doing the routine task he had done before. But molten metal doesn't wait. When it spills, it floods, and in that pit, there was nowhere safe to go. In a blink of an eye, tons of liquid steel poured downward. It splashed, hissed, and surged like a wave of fire, and Jawalen was trapped. The hose in his hand was useless against something that hot and that violent. He couldn't climb out fast enough, and the molten steel engulfed him. Obviously, the human body can't withstand contact with such temperatures. Even being within feet of molten steel can cause second and third degree burns, with direct contact being way worse than fire. It destroys tissue instantly, burning through skin, muscle, and bone. Witnesses later reported he was incinerated almost immediately, with the steel filling the pit and consuming everything in it. There was no chance for him to escape, no moment to shield himself. One instant he was working, the next he was gone. Co-workers who saw it described the chaos. People yelling, others scrambling back, and the heat forcing them away even as they wanted to help. The plant shut down in shock, and by the time emergency responders did arrive, there was nothing they could do. John Wayland Patterson was dead. The aftermath revealed even more horror. OSHA investigated and found that death had been preventable. The company had failed to follow basic safety procedures. There was no proper confined space program, inadequate training, and no clear process for dealing with leaks of molten metal. Elwood Engineered Casting was cited for 11 serious violations, and fines totaling more than $145,000 were issued, but fines mean little compared to a life lost. To understand the magnitude of what happened, you have to picture it second by second. Patterson in the pit spraying down a leak, the sound of molten steel dripping, a hiss as it hit moisture, a vibration through the floor, then the surge, liquid metal pouring down, splashing outward, glowing orange-white in the dim early morning light. He would have seen it in only an instant before it hit, basically a wall of fire rolling toward him. The heat alone would have scorched his skin before the steel even touched, and when it touched, there was no surviving that. What's kinda sad to think about is his death was one of the thousands and dangerous jobs across the US every year. The truth is, most people never think about what it takes to make the metal in their cars, their trains, and their machines. They don't see the men like John Wayland Patterson who stand in pits at 5 in the morning holding hoses while liquid steel flows above them. But it has to be done, and sometimes it comes at a cost. At only 30 years old, Patterson left behind a fiancée and 2 young children. He was remembered as someone with humor, compassion, and a giving nature. Those things matter, but so does the way he died. Because his death wasn't just a random bad luck. It was the direct result of an industry where hazards are well known and where safety failures are often brushed aside until tragedy forces change. By the time he was in his late 50s, Carlos Len had worked more than his share of hard jobs. He was 57 years old in 2020, living in rural Alabama, the kind of place where steady work often meant factories, farms, or plants tied to the massive poultry industry that dominates the state. Alabama is one of the largest chicken producing states in the country, and the Tyson Keystone plant in Baker Hill was one of the main employers in the region. For many people, it wasn't a dream job, but it was a paycheck, and for men like Carlos, that mattered. At his age, this wasn't a first job or a teenage tryout at a factory life. It was the kind of work you would take because you know it pays the bills. Plants like Keystone didn't just hire young labor, they leaned on experienced men and women who could be counted on to show up day after day and endure the grind. The hours were long and the conditions were harsh, but it was steady, and in a place like Baker Hill, steady was everything. Carlos would have walked through the same heavy doors each shift, pulling on the protective gear the plant required. Rubber boots for the slick floors, gloves for the wet machinery, a hard hat, and maybe a smock or apron. For someone not used to it, the inside of the plant could be overwhelming. Bright lights glared overhead, conveyor belts stretched across the rooms, the constant hiss of water and cleaning sprays echoed against the metal walls. The air smelled faintly of bleach, raw chicken, and damp concrete. But for Carlos, this was familiar. It was the rhythm of his job. On August 31st, 2020, Carlos Len reported for his shift, just like he had done countless times before. His task that day was cleaning around the conveyor system. That might sound simple, but inside a poultry processing plant, it was one of the most dangerous parts of the work. The conveyors were long, motor-driven belts that carried chicken from one section of the plant to the other. They ran on rollers and gears, constant and strong. Workers like Carlos had to keep them free of debris and buildup, which meant leaning in close, spraying water, scrubbing, or reaching into tight spaces. The plant was loud and wet that day, just like always. The floor was slick underfoot, with the belts rattling with each steady grind. Carlos moved along the line with his hose, focused on keeping the machinery clean. He knew the danger, but this was part of the job. In plants like Keystone, you didn't stop the conveyors unless something went terribly wrong, and then suddenly it did. While Carlos was cleaning, part of him got too close to the moving machinery. Whether it was clothing, a glove, or just the force of the rollers catching, the conveyor seized hold of him, and in an instant he was pulled forward. Machines like that don't hesitate, they keep turning, dragging in whatever they catch, and Carlos's body was drawn into the boat's relentless pull. Nearby co-workers saw it happen. His body pressed into the rollers as the machine ground on. Metal and rubber was crushing him as shouts erupted across the room. People screamed his name, scrambled toward the emergency shutoff, hands fumbling against slick steel as they tried to free him, but the conveyor kept running, its mechanical hum unchanged, indifferent to the human life caught in its grip. To really picture it, the scene was horrific. Blood spilled onto the wet floor, mixing with water in a thin red sheen. Workers pulled at him, some slipping as they tried to stop the conveyor, but it was too late. By the time the machine stopped, the damage was already catastrophic. Carlos had been crushed where he stood, his body mangled by the very equipment he had been assigned to clean. When emergency responders finally arrived, the plant was in chaos. The machine had just been running so steadily, now sat silent. Its frame smeared with what remained of the struggle. But Carlos was still there, lifeless, with his co-workers in shock, many of them unable to even look at the conveyor. The responders worked quickly to recover him, but there was nothing left to save. For the men and women who had been working beside him, the memory would not fade. They had seen him caught, heard the sickening sound of flesh and bone against machinery, and felt the helplessness of pulling with all their strength and realizing it wasn't enough. A factory floor that always felt routine was now scarred with a new reality, how fast life can be taken in a place like this. After his death, the OSHA opened an investigation to determine how such a fatal accident could happen inside one of the country's largest poultry processors. What inspectors found was clear. Like with most incidents, the tragedy wasn't an unpredictable mishap. It was preventable. They determined that Tyson had failed to protect workers from hazardous energy on the conveyor system Carlos had been assigned to clean. Federal law requires what's called a lockout/tagout procedure. Machinery must be powered down, locked, and tagged so it cannot start or continue moving while a worker is cleaning or repairing it. At the Keystone plant, obviously, that procedure wasn't being followed. Instead, employees like Carlos were sent to clean the equipment while it was still energized and moving, exposing them to exactly the kind of entanglement hazard that killed him. The agency cited Tyson for multiple serious violations, including not developing or enforcing a proper lockout/tagout program, and allowing unsafe cleaning practices. In total, OSHA issued fines of more than $160,000 connected to Carlos's death and related hazards at the plant. In addition to the fines, OSHA placed Tyson under pressure to change its practices. The company was required to correct that violations, retrain workers, and adopt safer procedures going forward. The findings also fed into a broader pattern. Tyson had actually been already cited at other facilities for similar failures, meaning OSHA viewed the Baker Hill case as part of a repeated problem, not a one-time oversight. When the plant reopened, the conveyor was cleaned, the floor scrubbed, and production resumed. Boxes of chicken continued to move down the lines, just as they did before. But for those who had knew Carlos, or even just stood near him that day, the images stayed. The man who walked in for his shift that morning never walked out again.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.